This is my 1975 Ag175. So, my 1975 Yamaha. Now, this is the Ag175, which is the ag bike version. Essentially, from what I know, it shares most of its parts with the DT175. So these, obviously, is a two-stroke bike. Things I know is that the engine probably won't turn over. It's going to need a new carburetor. The airbox has some schmutz in it. Needs a new chain. Obviously, the rear brake's not on properly. The front brake's not on properly. The seat's hacked up. So there's a lot of work to do. My sort of vision for this bike, I think, is to get it running and riding, but keep the look of it. So obviously, it's going to need new tyres and probably a new exhaust and some different things, but I want it to be retro. And I want it to be something we can just ride and have fun with. That's really what it's what it's for. So, good thing is it's old enough to be on Club Rego, which means it's only going to cost like 60 bucks a year to have it registered. And being an ag bike, you can have it registered. So obviously it needs a headlight and everything else, but that's sort of the vibe I'm going with my series. So I think to start with, I'm going to pull this thing apart, check out what's wrong with it, see what parts I need, order all of that, and then try to get it running without doing anything to it. So anyway, if you want to see what I do with this one, be sure to follow my build series. So there's a very good chance that we won't be reusing that. The next thing I really wanted to do was take the exhaust off. It's welded on there, which that doesn't sound like a big issue. You can just cut that off. But, are you gonna focus? It's also welded on to the studs. The studs have been made a one piece. I don't even understand how you end up with that sort of stuff. There's snails in there. I think that used to be the air filter. Inside of your engine shouldn't have cobwebs in it, so that's good. So the engine is out of the bike and the bike is now clean. I let it soak last night with some WD-40 on all of the bolts that I plan to remove. So hopefully they'll stop snapping and breaking every time I go to do something. Now the next thing I want to do is get this front wheel replaced. As you can see, it's very ratty looking, tyres stuffed, front brakes stuffed. To be honest with you, pretty much everything from about here forwards is stuffed. These are the forks off of a 2001 DT175. Now, as you can see, they're a lot bigger. The front wheel is a lot bigger. Everything's a lot bigger, including the front brake. I'm not exactly sure if it'll fit, but they were very cheap. So I thought, why not? So, let's get this head stem undone and get that off. I did measure this section of the head stem on my bike versus the bike that these came off. And they were close, but I mean, that really doesn't mean a lot. The bearings on this fell out when it was removed by the looks of it, so that's going to be interesting. Anyway, let's get that on there and see if it fits. This is what we were working with. Little tiny front brake, little tiny forks, and this is what we've got now. Much, much better. Such an improvement. It is going to limit my turning a little bit, as you can see there. I'm losing about an inch of travel between the spaces. But that's okay. I mean, look at the size of the fork tubes. We've got a much bigger tube. This is literally nearly double the size of what we've got over there. Front brake, again, easily double the size of what I had. Bigger front wheel, bigger forks, and bigger brakes. Cannot go wrong. The only thing about this is they are off a heavier bike. So I don't know what the rating's going to be like, what the handling's going to be like, but I think regardless, it'll be an improvement. The next thing we need to solve is this little situation. So I've pulled the engine apart. This moves, and that's it. That's the only movement we're going to get. So I looked at it and I thought, you know what? I don't reckon that's worth rebuilding. There's a few reasons for it. Little things like this big chip out of the case, the fact that it's seized, how dirty it is, the fact that it's seized, the fact that it's seized is a big contributor. So I thought, well, what do? So the options are, we go and buy a different engine, we rebuild the original engine, or we upgrade to something else. Now, they've all got pros and cons. Obviously, working with the original engine means that we get to keep it original. However, it's already past that point. Rebuilding the same motor has its benefits. One of them being you get a brand new motor because you're rebuilding it, and it's a straight bolt-in fit. The downside to rebuilding it is you're not going to get anything else out of this bike. Now, we can tune it up and get a bit more power. Stock, they're only, I think, 9 horsepower or 8 horsepower. I believe the DT version of this bike made something like 11 or 12. And I did read somewhere about them being capable of 17, something like that. Now, the other option is we go away from a 4-bolt head and go to a 6-bolt head. Those motors make 17 horsepower dead stock, and then you can tune it from there instead of it being at its absolute peak at 17 horsepower. And as it turns out, I was able to get one relatively cheap. This is what I've ended up with. This is the original motor. Now, as you can see, there are some differences straight away. The cases are different, the side cases, and the actual casting on the engines are different. Now, the other thing, 6-bolt head instead of a 4-bolt head. It's also a 6-speed instead of, I believe these are a 4-speed, and 17 horsepower. Now, the carb is different, the head's different, everything about them is really different, except when we look at things like how they mount. Now, mount at the back, mount at the back, mount at the front, mount at the front. They both look the same. The difference is this mount at the bottom here completely different on the two motors. So in theory, that should just go straight into there. I've got a feeling that bottom mount, I'm gonna have to make a bracket. On the original engine, you can see it's a lot further down than on this one. Looking at this versus that and there. Otherwise, they're essentially the same. So there's not really anything else to do other than to just put it in there and see what it does. Yeah. Small issue. This back bracket here, the engine's actually wider than the original. You can see it's got these little rubber bushes in there. That's actually what's making it wider. The other issue is this bottom bracket. That's where it's supposed to mount, all the way down there, and it's all the way up there. Next is the front. I can't get the front to come down because of the back. But the engine's not where it needs to be. The engine needs to rotate. The engine needs to rotate like this, it needs to be like that. That back bracket really a big issue there. It's not even funny. So for those of you playing at home, this is not a straight bolt-in fit, but that's okay. Now, the front one more or less fits. It is like a millimeter wider, so you could either grind the ends of the engine or whatever, but a little tap and a nudge and it fits. Now the back, this is where it's going to be a tricky one. So as you can see, it is significantly wider than the frame. Significantly wider. But that's okay because, like I said, I'm going to box that section in, I think. It's going to be a bit tricky because we are talking tight in there. Tight. But that's okay. We'll just grind that section out, make a nice little boxed area around it, and then I'll re-weld the tabs on. So these plates here, what I was originally thinking, these are actually the leftover plates from when I had my engine mounts laser cut for the Dodge, which is over there. Now the problem with that is, as you can see, the size of the hole is very different. So that's probably not going to work unless we weld some washers to it, which we could do, but probably defeats the purpose of using it. I do, however, have some decently sized leftover plate. So we might use some of this to sort of box this back in and get some rigidity back into it once we're done. Now the other option is I do have the tabs that I cut off the frame originally, which are actually double layered, which is interesting. So we could hack these up, flatten them out again and whatnot, but the problem is they actually don't really fit. Like, they kind of fit here, but the problem is that the frame's actually that way. So they're never going to line up. They're going to sit like that. So I think these, unless we cut them, I'm going to cut that whole back section off, weld it from the top. That might actually not be such a bad idea. But anyway, we'll keep investigating. This is one of the mounts that I've made up for the engine. So this is going to sit in here, and the plan is for it to sit somewhere like that, and then the engine should hopefully be able to slot in like this and then come down, and then hopefully the rear mount will, so the bottom mount will work out alright. Now I cannot remember which side went where because it has been a little while. I believe that that goes on the other side and this goes on this side, and this is like this. Something something like that. So, we'll get the engine back in, get it bolted up, we'll get it level, we'll get it straight, and then we'll try to figure out how to get those mounts to attach to this in the best and strongest way, and also so that it looks semi-factory. The problem I've got now is trying to level the engine. We'll get it, I don't think it's going to sit level, that's the problem. I think we're gonna find that it sits a little bit skewed at the back, so the back will be up higher. The reason for that is that the frame on this bike, it comes down at a more aggressive angle than what the newer models do. The newer models come down and then sort of level out, whereas this has a nice curve to it, but that means that the engine hits in places that it wouldn't normally. Because of that, we're going to have the back up a little bit higher, but I think we can compensate that by having the back of the bike physically lower. So I'll put shorter shocks in the rear, so the bike will sit kind of on a lean, but the engine should be level with the ground. Now, the next part is that the engine is wider than the frame, so getting these little brackets to fit in there is going to be a bit of a challenge because they don't actually line up where they should. So we'll work on that and we will figure out a creative solution like we always do. So leave that with me for a bit. We've had the engine in and out a couple of times, just test fitting everything. Now, the top mounts, they're fine. Front mounts, they're fine. Everything's a very tight fit, but it all goes back together. Where I'm struggling with is this bottom mount. Now, I ended up getting the original mounting point off of a 80 something model, same model as what the engine came out of. I knew a guy that had a frame that he didn't need. So we cut that part out of there. It's just easier than trying to make a mount for it if I could just use the original stuff. So that's in there, but I need to cut it down to size to fit between the frame rails on this, which is obviously a lot narrower. So I'm going to pull the engine back out. I've marked where I need to cut. We'll cut that, put the engine back in, and then hopefully we can weld that piece in. And then we can pretty well call the engine mounting done. Then we've got to focus on the rear wheel. Got to order shocks for it. Worry about wiring. Get these spacers here put on so that my steering works and doesn't hit the tank. Mount the tank. Get a seat. And then the mock-up should be pretty well done. So there's not really that much left in the scheme of things. This is definitely the hardest part. So anyway, get the engine back out and we'll get that mount cut. Alright, our bottom cross member is welded in. Actually came out pretty good. So now, well, I don't know what to do next here. I think I'm going to have to tip the frame upside down to weld the underside. And I do want to do something in this section, get that prettied up a bit. But it's going to involve some more steel, which I don't currently have. So I think we'll move on to something else now, so I don't have to go and stop doing what we're doing. I've been sitting here for the last 10 minutes trying to figure out what to do next. I have an oil tank, which arrived yesterday. Forgot all about it. So this is off an Enduro, which I believe is the same as a DT175. This is off an early 80s or late 70s model. Must be late 70s. Didn't actually have anything in the description. Now, on the ag bike, this should mount there. something like that. But on the Enduro model, it mounts on the other side. The other difference between the Enduro, or this particular model, whatever this one's off, is that it has a battery holder built into it. Now the Ag bike doesn't actually have a battery holder at all in the tank. I don't know if they're supposed to have a battery, but the original tank of this bike wouldn't have had a battery holder. So I'm planning on mounting that here, because that's where the tank is on the later model motorbike. Now, it's going to be a reasonably easy thing to mount. There's actually already thread in here. So all I need is a couple of bolts that fit into those threads. And then we just need to make some tabs up and weld it on. I really like this. I think it's actually going to suit the bike. We're not painting that either. That's going to stay exactly as it is. So I found a couple of bolts that are going to fit, and I had a bracket on the bike that I had to cut off. And I have a bracket from our Hi-Song project that I'm no longer using. So the plan is going to be to repurpose these, hopefully. One bracket on that side, one on there. We'll weld them to the frame, and this should be able to mount up. Okay, this is our first bracket. So as you can see, I've notched it so that it'll sit against the frame. So if you're looking at it, the bracket's going to sit like that. And then we just have to make another one to come off here and go up so it sits on the bike. So we'll get this tack welded on and I'll show you how it sits. My brackets are finally installed. So let's test it out. That's one. That's two. Amazing. And this is how it looks. Now, is it perfect? Absolutely not. In no way is that perfect. But I think it fits the theme of this bike very, very well. And I'm very happy with how the brackets turned out. Like I said, that's the, what is that? That's a clutch cable bracket off a Hi-Song I cut down, made to fit. And this bracket back here is actually the bracket that I just cut off the top here. I don't even know what it used to do, but it was never attached to anything since I've had the bike. And all I had to do was cut one of these off from down here, which used to be for the airbox, which we're not going to reuse. So what you'll do is you'll undo your seat. I'll make up a hinge mechanism for the new seat. Hopefully I can just reuse some of this existing hardware. That'll flip over. You put your oil in there, have your battery sitting here, and then I'm hoping that right here is where our filter will end up sitting so that it's out of the way. Guard will stay the same, engine in, front guard will stay the same for now. We might do something better later on, but that'll get us going. It's coming along very nicely. I think that pretty well concludes the majority of the fabrication work. Engine's in, that's on. The only thing now I have to do is the rear wheel, which I will show you. Now, as I said earlier, this is not the wheel off this bike. This is off a later model. It's off the same series as the engine and the front forks are off, but it's a different year. But anyway, they're very similar. Now, the issue we're facing at the moment is I had to cut the axle out of the original wheel to get the wheel off. So the axle we currently have is a little bit too long, and the spaces we've got don't work because the hub's wider, and this brake has a little slot that it sits into to locate it, whereas the original one had a bolt that went into that bracket there. So there's a bit of work to do to make that fit, and I'm not sure if we're going to do that work because it does involve some machining. So I can outsource the machining part of it, we just need to get some spaces made up. But I'm not sure if it's going to fit the deadline of what we're doing. I think we might be better off putting the original wheel back on for now, getting that sorted and working, and then we can look at upgrading to that later on once we've got everything else sorted out. Alright guys, well that's going to be the end of this episode. There's not really a lot else I can do until parts arrive. We've got most of the fabrication stuff done that I wanted to get done. Next I've got to get the rear wheel sorted, which I'm waiting on some shocks for. We've got to get the wiring sorted, which I'm waiting on the ignition barrel for. So there is still stuff to do obviously, but we're just going to wait for parts. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. Stay tuned for next week's episode, and I'll see you on the next one.